International trade, some other terms for this concept is trade, foreign trade, or economic globalization. This refers to any kind of economic transaction between two or more countries. In economic terminology, the word trade is used to refer to international trade, not domestic trade, where some domestic or US only companies sell their products inside the US. The term trade typically refers to international trade. When we say international trade, we are talking about exports and imports for a country. Exports are typically shown by letter X and imports by letter I in economic terminology. As you would know, just as a reminder, exports refer to selling those products that are manufactured inside the US, and selling those products outside the US is exports. That would be US exports. And imports refer to the opposite of that. So bringing those products that are manufactured outside the US into the US economy and selling them here. So when we buy a BMW, for example, that would be a US import since BMWs are manufactured in Germany. And when let's say a German individual buys a Levi's jeans, a pair of Levi's jeans, then he would be contributing to the US exports since Levi's is a US company. And I'm assuming that their manufacturing plant is inside the US, which it may not be actually, but perhaps Harley-Davidson could be a better example since we're discussing vehicles. So Harley-Davidson is manufactured in Wisconsin, inside the US. So when the company sells its product outside the US, that would be a US export. In the rest of this first lecture, we will discuss the history of the schools of thought on international trade. For the time period between 1500, when capitalism first began to surface in northwestern Europe, until 1776, when a landmark book, which we'll discuss in the next slide, was published. For a good 2.5 centuries or so, the perception of international trade was what we now call mercantilism. This approach is simply relying on the assumption that maximizing a country's wealth could be accomplished by maximizing its trade surplus. Trade surplus is simply the difference between exports and imports in a country, assuming exports are larger than imports. Now, so this is another way of saying that exports are beneficial for an economy, therefore they should be maximized, and imports are not beneficial, and therefore they should be minimized. This approach was mercantilism, and the idea was that when this happens, when the trade surplus is maximized in an economy, then it would mean that more of the domestic consumption would be satisfied by domestic producers, because remember, imports are minimized. So US consumption would be satisfied mostly by US producers, and also because US exports are maximized, it would mean that the US companies would be selling as much as they can their products outside the US. And this is a beneficial thing because exports mean that the entire world is your potential sales market, and no matter how large an economy is, the rest of the world or the entire world will by logic will always be a larger sales market. So therefore, it's beneficial to sell products internationally. Maximizing exports and minimizing imports is the recipe for boosting the prosperity in a nation. It will create US companies that are as large as they can be, and as a result, US GDP, gross domestic product, would be as large as it could be, and the unemployment rate would be as small as it could be because of the high GDP and high production volume. This theory, this approach to international trade was the original one, and as I mentioned, it took about 2.5 centuries, and almost all world countries' economies went by this approach to international trade called mercantilism. Then came 1776, and the Scottish economist by the name Adam Smith wrote a seminal book on international trade called The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith is considered to be the founding father of modern economics, and this book is his top book, even though he has 2 or 3 other books that also were quite groundbreaking at the time. In this book, Adam Smith made the simple. He said that mercantilism was wrong because maximizing exports may indeed be good for an economy, but it doesn't mean that minimizing exports is also good. He argued that both exports and imports are good for an economy, and therefore the recipe for a prosperous society or economy would be one that maximizes both exports and imports, and therefore any trade restriction on imports, which we'll discuss them later what those instruments are, should be minimized or just eliminated altogether. And his explanation was this. He said that every country is naturally endowed in a different way. Naturally endowed means their climate is different, their natural resources are different, minerals and all other things are different in each country. So therefore, because different resources are abundant in different countries, each country can produce a different product more cheaply than the other, or more efficiently than the other, economically speaking. This idea is called the theory of absolute advantage. One country having an absolute advantage in production of a product over. So therefore, he said that if countries don't impose any import restrictions and adopt what we today call free trade, then that country would maximize its wealth in 3 different ways. First and foremost, the country's domestic producers can sell their products that they can more efficiently produce in comparison to another nation to a much larger global market. Because think about it, if you lift any kind of import restrictions, then other countries' governments would reciprocate. So therefore, the entire world markets will open up to you as a potential sales market. Secondly, they can also produce their products more cheaply, simply because they would be able to find inputs more cheaply. So imagine, let's go by the example we gave earlier. Harley Davidson, the U.S. company that manufactures motorcycles in the U.S. If import restrictions are lifted inside the U.S., this means that Harley Davidson company can import inputs that it uses for its own manufacturing from other countries where they are sold more cheaply at a lower price. So therefore, Harley Davidson can turn around and lower the price that it charges to its own customers accordingly. A third dynamic is that it would improve the purchasing power in the society to lift import restrictions, because it would mean that foreign countries' companies that can manufacture certain items more cheaply than the U.S. companies can freely sell their products inside the U.S., and because they can produce them more efficiently, they can charge lower prices than their U.S. counterparts or competitors, and as a result, from the consumer's viewpoint, they would see more choices in the shelves in the various markets, and those choices would include a number of cheaper foreign products as well, which is in effect similar to someone giving some additional money for the consumers. It just simply boosts their purchasing power. In other words, their dollar goes further if there are cheaper options coming from abroad in the marketplace. So let's discuss the theory of absolute advantage in a real life example. Consider England, a country in northwestern Europe with a very rainy climate, as you would know. So because it rains so much out there, there are plenty of lands for animals to graze. So as a result, it's much cheaper to raise sheep there. And as a result, you would have abundance of wool that you don't even know what to do with. So as a result, producing wool could be done much more cheaply than some other country in an area like England. On the other side, consider Portugal, a Mediterranean country, where with a sunny and very mild climate. And in such an area, it would take minimal resources for farmers to grow oranges. So therefore, it would be much cheaper for a citrus company to produce oranges in an area like Portugal. So here you have it, two different countries, different parts of Europe, very different climates, so their natural endowments are different. As a result, what companies in each of those countries can produce more efficiently or more cheaply is different. So as a result, England produces wool more cheaply and Portugal produces oranges more cheaply. And Adam Smith tells us that England therefore should sell wool to Portugal and buy oranges from Portugal in return. This is the way to prosperity for both countries. That's how they can maximize their national wealth. Instead of what mercantilists were advocating before Adam Smith, which was everybody should try to produce as much of their stuff of the goods and services they consume by themselves domestically. They should try to maximize their exports but minimize their imports. So Adam Smith was a major blow to the mercantilist line of thinking when it comes to international trade. The government of England decided to give Adam Smith's proposal a chance, and they chose corn as a sector to do this. So they opened their corn markets to foreign trade. They lifted all previously existing trade restrictions on corn, imported corn. So Canadian and American corn began to be sold in England, and this led to corn prices to fall dramatically. And as a result, most other foods prices also fell because corn is an input in many other products, at least it was at the time. And then as a result, purchasing power of consumers rose. So they now pay less money for buying various food items, so their purchasing power improved, and as a result their consumption increased, and as a result British GDP rose, and Adam Smith was declared to be a winner in this argument, and his theory of absolute advantage began to penetrate policymaking, first in England and then rest of Europe and then in the United States.